Welcome back. And now I'm joined by Redaction's good friend, Kit Roberts, who's here to help us understand some of the biggest issues in world politics today. And of course, as ever, one of those is Ukraine. Now, Kit, you recently wrote an opinion piece for Redaction in which you compared what's happening in Ukraine to Vladimir Putin's actions in Syria. Now, of course, Russia has been involved in the war in Syria. It has intervened on the side of the Assad regime. Could you talk us through your thought process on this? I'll get the article up in front of us.
Yeah, so the main point of what I was trying to get across in this is drawing a comparison between the media strategies that Vladimir Putin and Russia have employed in both of these scenarios. So what I kind of argue is that the strategies for like deploying misinformation and like sort of flooding the online environment with basically lies around what's happening in either of these places, in either Ukraine or in Syria, kind of makes it so incredibly difficult to actually get to the bottom of what is actually happening there. So part of the reasoning behind that is because there's so much misinformation out there that by the time you've like got round to dispelling one round of misinformation, like the next one has come along basically, or like another three have come along. It's like, you know, cutting off a hydra's head. You know, you dispel one lie and then like three sort of rise out of it. So even with like massive amounts of like social media coverage and people on the ground talking about their experiences or filming things that they're seeing, obviously there's been some absolutely horrific things that have been coming out of Ukraine on social media that people have just filmed on their smartphone. Even those can be called into question by this strategy, because you can just say, well, it's staged, well, it's fake news, they're crisis actors. This is a strategy that Putin and Russia has deployed previously in Syria. So one of the main examples of this would be with the group, the White Helmets. So the White Helmets are an organization which essentially provides emergency services relief in unoccupied areas of Syria. So they work very prominently in the Idlib province in the north of the country, for example. And basically what they do is they'll go into bombed out buildings and they will pull people out of the rubble, basically. They're known for, you know, because they have their white helmets. So they were the subject of a sustained misinformation campaign from Russia, who basically called them terrorists, they called them jihadists, all manner of like horrible things. So they're calling these people's intentions into question, calling them, you know, crisis actors. Everything is staged, it's not actually happened, despite verified evidence from, I know the New York Times ran quite a big piece which confirmed that Russian planes were in fact targeting hospitals deliberately, confirming incidences of things were like double tap strikes, for example, which is where there's a strike on a location and then there's another one there about 20 minutes, half an hour later, which is specifically intended to target aid workers that rush to help people who've been injured or killed in that initial attack. So even when there's like pretty conclusive evidence of these kind of things happening from like prolonged investigations, it takes a lot more effort to just say, you know, to assemble all that evidence, to collate it, to present it properly, clearly, cogently, than it does to just say, well, that's fake, they're staged. And the problem is, once that is out there, once that little kind of seed of doubt has been sowed in the back of someone's mind, it's very difficult to get rid of it, basically. And so that's kind of the upshot of that. I'm drawing a comparison with these strategies that have been used in Syria before, and now we are unfortunately seeing those same kind of media strategies also being used around incidents in Ukraine. So the main example in Ukraine would be the attack on the maternity hospital, where I think it was actually
in Mariupol, right?
Yes, that's correct. Yeah, where I think it was actually the Russian embassy in London has tweeted out that the people involved in this are crisis actors. I think they even made a specific allegation about a young woman who was being carried out, was photographed being carried out, and saying that she was actually an Instagram model and all this kind of stuff. again, once that's in the back of people's minds, it's very difficult to get rid of it. Even if it's, provably false, it's very difficult to push that aside. And that's kind of what I'm arguing in this piece, basically, is that there's a lot of similarities in those media strategies in just sort of like swamping the discourse around this war with misinformation.
And it's a fairly age-old tactic too. We see this tactic of just flurrying people with misinformation in a way to distract. We saw that with Trump, for example, when he was running for president, putting out outlandish statement after outlandish statement, misinformation after misinformation. And you'll get plenty of good faith, earnest journalists and other politicians who will just immediately leap to try to put out the fire of countering the misinformation. But they're not getting the point of what Trump's trying to achieve there. He's just trying to get people talking. He's trying to plant that seed of doubt, like you say, trying to signal to a certain voter base that he's the person to listen to. And of course, it just gets his opposition chasing their tails, just constantly trying to put out the fire of every seed of misinformation he's lying. And in doing so, they're playing the game on his terms. Would you say that's a fair comparison as to what's going on here?
I think that's a very similar strategy. Yes, I think it's a very fair comparison. I think it's more or less exactly the same, really. It's pumping out that misinformation. You don't have to think about researching things. You don't have to think about, fact checking, all that kind of stuff. The point isn't to do that. It's very, very quick. You can mass produce these lies, basically. All you have to do is have, however many themes or hashtags or memes or anything like that you're just pumping out into social media platforms where people are going to see them. And that's enough to kind of call that narrative into question. So even though it is, as we've said, like the lies about the maternity hospital in Mariupol were provably false, but the point is that's already there. People have been chasing, putting out fires, like you said, and it's constantly reacting to it. It's very difficult to actually kind of push this back on a sort of grander scale or a grander strategy, if that makes sense, because it's just so easy to pump out lies. You don't need any skill, you don't need any training, you just need the audacity to be able to put this stuff out, basically, into whatever kind of platforms are going out. So it's very difficult to actually engage with it on a sort of grander level in terms of media strategy. Like you say, you can only really react to it, unfortunately, unless someone can think of a way to actually prevent that from happening in the first place.
Let's have a look back at Syria, though, because the eyes of the world have been focused on Ukraine over the past couple of months. And people are seeing what's Putin's interest in Ukraine. It's territorial gain, trying to reclaim some sort of old imperialist glory of Russia. This might have a lot of people wondering, why did Putin have interest in Syria? What was going on there?
It's difficult to say, I think, exactly why. I do know that actually Putin's involvement or Russia's involvement was not so much as a result of petitioning directly from the Assad regime. Obviously, there is some involvement there, but actually one of the people, the main people who made a big impression on Putin when he was sent to Moscow to speak with him, to meet with him, was the Iranian general Qasem Soleimani, who was killed in a drone strike in Iraq. So what is interesting is that it could well be Iranian influence in the region, like pulling Russia in or seeking Russian backing in there, rather than a direct kind of petition from Bashar al-Assad. There's also there's questions there about spheres of influence within the region. There's questions about like holding up a regime which could be said to be it's people who are, for example, sympathetic to the Assad regime would argue that it's anti-imperialist, that it's anti-West, that it's managed to survive for a very long time, that's very much like a sort of a Bashar an Assad and a Kremlin line to take. So it could be something about preserving that kind of narrative around the region. There's also potential like economic interest in there as well. There's all manner of, I think, reasons. What we do know for certain, though, is that it is Russian intervention which has more or less kept al-Assad in power and kept him alive, really. If we're being honest, like he would either be in exile or dead if it wasn't for Russian intervention moving into that. I think another thing as well, though, what I would say is that it's definitely quite important to remember that it's not just the petitioning from Syria directly that's brought Russia into it, though. It is this kind of Iranian proxy. It's this incredibly influential figure in Soleimani going to Moscow and petitioning Putin. And actually, there's a really interesting book, an interesting book about Soleimani called The Shadow Commander, which is it's definitely worth to read. And it speaks about when it's describing this particular episode, it talks about the almost like personal impression that Soleimani may have had upon Putin. So you have someone who's very kind of has grown up in a very sort of military setting, kind of exemplifies this like machismo, like, you know, very strong leadership, very masculine, that Putin kind of wants to kind of push for himself, I think. I mean, you know, it with his like photo shoots where he's riding horses with his shirt off and all that kind of thing. But
we'd rather blank those out of our memory, wouldn't we?
Well, that's it. It's like one of those lies. Once it's there, you can't get rid of it. But yeah, this is someone who's clearly made an impression on Putin and who's been able to kind of draw. It's not necessarily there's other factors as well in this, but I do think that this particular meeting, this particular incident has been very influential in drawing Russia in to the region. So I think it's also as much as working with Iran to kind of keep that sort of regional influence, those regional spheres of influence around the country. It's in their interests to keep al-Assad in power rather than whoever would replace him.
Now, as you're all aware, Redaction Report is raising money for Ukraine. We'll include a link below. We are raising money for Save the Children. This is also not only via our main show, but via limited series podcast we're running. First episode is available to watch here on YouTube. Follow into our channel. You'll be able to find the first episode on Ukrainian history. Please do donate if you're feeling generous. Obviously, it is a very grave humanitarian crisis in Ukraine. And if you want to learn a bit more about Ukraine and donate a bit of money, please follow the link. But for now, that's all for our April show. We'll see you again in May. Goodbye from me, goodbye from Kit, and we'll see you all soon.